I just want to start out by thanking everyone for coming and being part of the Stand Together Shabbaton and really making this a success. So thank you everyone that's here. For our last session of the morning and afternoon portion, Rabbi Hell and Reverend Jessie MacMillan
Rabbi Jacobs is gonna.
and Rabbi Jacobs are going to talk about interfaith relations and in the post October 7th world. Reverend Jessie MacMillan, we're so happy to have you. And let me know if I missed anything from my Google search and putting your biography together. But you've had a distinguished career. You've been in New Mexico, Florida, Maryland, Delaware, and you're currently the pastor at the Church of the Covenant in Cleveland at University Circle. You've previously been at Fairmount Presbyterian Church in Cleveland Heights, as well as the John Knox Presbyterian Church in North Olmsted, where your husband Tom is the senior pastor, and you're the proud parents of 4 adult sons.
You did well.
You can find anything online, right? Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. So we're so happy to have you here.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you everyone for staying. We know that it's us and then a nap or whatever else is happening today. So it's been a long day and it's been I'd say a great day, but we're discussing difficult topics. It's been a meaningful day, an educational day, an insightful day. It's my honor, it's our honor to have our partner and friend, Reverend MacMillan here, Jessie here by our side. And Jessie's really been by our side since October 7th and even prior. And that's one of the reasons we're here today to talk about we're doing some both behind the scenes and in front of the scenes work together. I think it's important to talk about that and to share that with our community. And Rabbi Jacobs and I are also here joined by Reverend MacMillan to be a little bit of a wrap up from the last 24 hours or so of some intense conversations as well. So that's sort of what the goal of this time period is. So I don't know, Jessie, if you wanted to say a couple of words, or I can open to.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for having me here and being a part of the discussion. Interfaith relations is very important to me, and it has been for most of my career. I won't say all, because I was pretty ignorant at one time and probably still am a bit. But for me, to go back a little before before October 7th, for me, it began in 2014 when I worked for the Presbytery, which is our regional governing body, a collection of churches, so to speak. And we would prepare people to go to our general assemblies, which is our national gatherings. And often there would be interfaith items on that national agenda. And so Lisi Shapiro would be one who would bring in a rabbi and some members, leaders in the Jewish community to help prep our commissioners. You know, we had 2 commissioners. They would go to this General Assembly, vote their conscience, but we wanted them to be informed. At that time, the Presbyterian Church National Gathering had only one Jewish organization interacting with the commissioners, and it was Jewish Voices for Peace. And so when commissioners from all over the country came and considered items on the agenda, that voice was the only one they heard. And so different presbyteries would try to better prepare their commissioners before they went. That particular year, the National Church made a divestment decision that was very unpopular in the local churches, including my own and my husband's, John Knox Presbyterian. And when we made that decision, not we in the sense, I wasn't a voter, but when our commissioners at the national level made that decision, I called Lisi before I came home to let her know I wanted to meet and tell her what happened, even though she was very well informed. And so I think that year, things just kept going to the extent where I thought, this is really important work. Part of being a pastor is interfaith relations, specifically with the Jewish community. So anyway, that's just a brief entry. I know it's not since October 7th, but before.
It's very important to be before. And Reverend MacMillan can also talk about our interactions with the Shalom Hartman Institute, which is a place that we often go to study. I'm hopefully going to study there this summer, and trips to Israel. And we are co-chairing a clergy interfaith trip to Israel that was planned originally before October 7th. It was actually supposed to go November of 2023, but obviously with post-October 7th and the war, we weren't able to go. And that was a sort of a wide swath of interfaith leaders, of rabbis and pastors, including both from Black churches as well as general churches in the area. And we are having those conversations, hopefully to have the trip again.
And I will mention how meaningful it was, the Sunday that we were supposed to be in Israel. I had set up a guest pastor, preacher already. But Rabbi Hal came and spoke to the church, and that was really important. He spoke about the hostages, and he stayed a while afterwards for people to interact with him. And that was just a really, it was wonderful of him to do that, in the sense of how hard it must have been to talk about it, even, and to do that outside of his own faith community. So people at my church remember that.
Well, it was with gratitude that Jessie opened up her church for me, and I brought Hersha's story then. Hersha's story that was only maybe 4 or 5 weeks after October 7th. So Hersha's story wasn't known across America. His mother, Rachel Goldberg, hadn't really become, or his parents, Rachel and John, hadn't become the international, basically, spokespeople for hostage families at that point. So focusing on an American Israeli. And I thought that was a very important message to bring to the church. And Jessie's not alone. Several of our colleagues have stood together, and I've seen them, as I think Harriet mentioned at the previous session, at all the commemorations and all the community programs that have been post-October 7th. There have been many of our colleagues there. I don't want to sugarcoat, because it is not every colleague is there, and not everyone has been as responsive, and some have a lot of questions and a lot of concerns. So, but sort of as we talked about in this last session, right, it's important to bring them to the table and to talk together. We really wanted to have an opportunity to answer some questions. This is more panel and response. And again, I'm really grateful for all that Jessie does. We had Jessie at our Seder at our home this year, Jessie and her husband. And I think it's important for all of us, to model these relationships of reaching out and getting to know each other. And I think as we've been talking throughout the weekend, we can't live in a bubble, and as I talked a little bit on Friday night services, when Noah built the ark, the instruction from God was to make a window. Even when Noah had to shelter and protect in order to survive a flood, Noah needed a window. And it wasn't just to send a bird out to find out when the waters had receded and that you could return to dry land. But it's because we can't live in this fortress. We can't live in a bubble. We are in community. We are with other peoples, other faiths, and that the only way to move forward is to understand each other and to build those bridges. Okay, so yeah. Okay, I see. Terry's asked a couple of questions. Not that we don't love you, but yeah, we'll hear some different voices. Nina, yeah. Nina.
Okay, I didn't know if you needed a microphone. So I have a question for you, Reverend Jessie. I know that you're on the campus of Case, and not only are you on a university campus, but you're right next door to Hillel, having been an alumna of Case. Anyway, do you have any relationship with the Hillel?
Yes, I do. One of the first people I introduced myself to when I began at Church of the Covenant, which was 2.5 years ago, was Jared Isaacson. And we've had some ongoing conversations since that time. I'm really glad we started our relationship before, before October 7th, but before a lot of other things too, because that's not been the only incident in Cleveland in the years I've been there. Most recently, we had Jared come and speak at our Sunday seminar event, which is our educational hour after church. And he did an amazing presentation that people really enjoyed. I asked him to speak what it was like for Jewish students, what it's been like since October 7th. And then to share some of his background and some about what interfaith relations on campus have been like since then. So that was very enlightening for people to get to know him. You might also remember that in addition to Hillel, within our church is space for the Muslim Student Association. And they do Friday prayers there, as well as their otherwise times that they gather for different reasons. And so it just was a very visual illustration of interfaith relationships at our little corner of the parking lot, where literally Hillel is here, the Muslim Student Association is here, and the church is right there in the midst of that. And we're very aware of that sort of juxtaposition and what we can or can't do. I was extremely grateful that they let us know when the organization Roots from Israel came to speak on campus, because I had visited Roots and heard them in Israel. And so to experience them here was incredible. And that was just at the level that some of our church folks needed, who didn't have high levels of understanding what's been going on. And so that was a great opportunity. And Jared didn't have to tell us that. He obviously had the whole thing figured out on campus, and they were speaking here and there and everywhere. And it was just an offer. There's a slice of time. Could you use them then? And I was grateful for that as well.
Just Roots, if you're unfamiliar, is also called Shorashim. And Roots is a grassroots community cooperation in the south of Israel. And you can correct me, Jessie, because you might know better, but it's between, it's a coexistence between Jews and Arabs within Israel. And Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger, who's an Orthodox rabbi, is one of the leaders of it. And he works with Arabs, and they not only are on speaking tours, but also it's about how their communities live together and grapple together.
And I think it's Jewish settlers.
Yes, they're settlers.
Yeah.
They're settlers, yes. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, done.
I was curious, following up because of your proximity, but also in general, when the encampments were going on at Case, et cetera, how much local clergy was called in to deal with any of that in terms of with the administration, and whether you felt part of the conversation?
That's a good question. I would have loved to be called on for that conversation and talking to the administration, and been able to offer anything, anyhow. We weren't called upon by the administration, and neither was the Interreligious Council at Case as a whole. My response when the encampment happened, before doing anything, I had been asked to speak by somebody who's not a case student and doesn't even live in Cleveland, but was visiting, and had relatives in my church, and said, you know, you should come to the encampment and speak, and there's gonna be an interfaith Seder. And I said, oh, really? That's interesting. And so I called Jared and I said, Jared, are you part of an interfaith Seder or something going on? And he said, no. And so I talked to him and got more of an understanding, and then walked over there with the Muslim Student Association faculty advisor, who is the one who has his office in the church building. And had the advice for me to stay out, which I followed. And I wasn't inclined toward being part of it without the people we consider to be partners in interfaith work. And if they're not a part of it and don't want to be a part of it, then it's really out for me too. There were some who were angry at me at church for that. And after that followed the request that we make a statement by my church members about a very global statement about the war. And that is something I ran by Lisi Shapiro when they came up with it, and by Ramez, I think, and Jared. And we managed not to make that statement, which I was very grateful about. So
I'm very grateful. Reverend MacMillan, I think, because even for me speaking at the church, I think there were some people who were unhappy within her own congregation. And actually the other speaker was a Reverend Chalker, who actually gave a very passionate pro-Israel sermon also. So I know he and I were both received some commentary that wasn't so flattering, which I know as someone who brings in speakers to my own synagogue, and if there's some people unhappy with it, it always gets back to me. So I know that we are very appreciative of how Reverend MacMillan stands with us and is very supportive of the Jewish community. I also want you to know that there are many things that happen behind the scenes. Just 2 weeks ago, AJC has 2 events over the year, where is an interfaith gathering. So just 2 weeks ago, and Reverend MacMillan was there. We have an interfaith Sukkot program, and a Sukkot's usually oftentimes here. It was a Park Synagogue this year, and there were 60 community members. 45 of the 60 were non-Jewish clergy, were clergy who were not Jewish, including Muslim clergy, as well as a spectrum of Christian clergy. So
was there a Hindu leader there as well? I found out later that there was somebody.
there was one, I think. Yeah, one, I think. Yeah. And then there's also the AJC Interfaith Seder in the spring. And tell you to be honest, there was a concern post October 7th this year, who would come, would people feel comfortable coming? There were definitely some interesting conversations. We had guided table conversations, but our non-Jewish clergy are still showing up to sit with us and talk with us, and we're very appreciative of that. As well, we also have a behind-the-scenes Jewish evangelical group that still meets regularly. We meet at the Jewish Federation building. That is more focused on study together. And that's where we sort of meet, is by studying Bible together. But that sort of then engenders other conversations. As well, there are other groups like this. There's Jewish Hispanic community conversations, and other places that, you may not be publicized, you may not read about them, but we continue to find ways to reach out and to build bridges. Adina? Yeah.
I know you've said that a way to sort of build bridges is to invite people into our homes, which we have done from time to time, but the reality is most of my community is not in Cleveland. And so I want to know what are, and inviting people into our homes is, one or two people at a time. How do we more broadly, I guess, how do we engage people not at Shabbat or Rosh Hashanah or Seder dinners to try and co-opt their support who aren't Jewish? And how do we get them to amplify their voices on our behalf?
No, and I think Elon spoke to this a little bit as well, but it's obviously a great question, and I think a lot of it is the making sure it's relational, not transactional, and that like preventative work is worth so much more than the responsive work. So the more we can be proactive about like not calling on each other in times of crisis when you need your most, but laying the groundwork ahead of time and having that relationship, because nothing's more powerful than the relational piece. And I think obviously you don't, the inviting them to your house is so important because you're the host and you're opening your home, and that's Abraham and Sarah, right? That's what we're supposed to do, have this open, welcoming tent. It's also rude to invite yourself into that, but I think it's also so important to go into their spaces and not just invite into ours, but go over there. The same question of who's showing up for us, but then asking ourselves, how have I showed up for them? And not just have I outsourced it to like, am I using Rabbi Heschel as my representative? I am so proud he's one of my absolute heroes, of course, but that's not enough. What have I personally done? There's somebody through GCC, through our work, Nate Self, who is up and coming reverend. I should know the terminology better, but he's on his way.
Episcopal priest. He's
Episcopal
on his way
priest.
to be, yeah.
On his way to be Episcopal priest. And he's wonderful. We've had coffee a number of times, and he came to Tikkun Leil Shavuot and came to our session, and that's late. That he was there late and participated, and I felt really great. And I'm thinking to myself during the session, have I reciprocated? And the answer is no. So I that's shame. I should, and I would like to.
I hear your question as a question of, as religious leaders, we have we have more availability to do these events. And your question is from, I think, just a normal person, like how do normal people get involved with these important relationships?
It's how do we ask for help from our help and
Mm-hmm.
visible support from our non-Jewish friends?
Yeah. And this might not then be exactly directed toward your question, but I know that at my husband's church, there are Abrahamic dinners that they have with just regular folks from the 3 Abrahamic traditions. They're doing it twice a year now and looking at more. And those have been forming relationships that can be called upon to help in times of need. It's more of a mass rather than 1 or 2 bigger groups of people from 3 different faiths. I'm hoping to do that sometime at Covenant, but it hasn't happened yet. Anyway, thanks.
I think that's a great model. And as I mentioned last night, we're also rebuilding our relationship with the sister church of Shiloh Baptist, of which now is in one of our original buildings. And this has to be a growth of a relationship, and because I said, not just a response to a crisis. And there are pockets of opportunities oftentimes for leadership. If you know about the Adler mission that the Jewish Federation runs, which is civic leaders and non-Jewish business leaders paired with sort of their matches within the Jewish community that then go to Israel and meet their match in Israel, and those relationships that live. But those are sort of small pockets of leaders. I think, right, your question is, to be honest, this is sort of what I've been saying is, I think it's time not to be shy, to ask people, to tell people, like, I need your support. Like, I'm feeling vulnerable, and So I think it's all, both it's a relationship, but it's also being able to express that. And not just being, we're very polite people oftentimes. Right? It might mean also hearing their story, hearing their version, hearing how they see the news and interpret it. So we have to be open to that and to accept it and to begin that dialogue then. But they may not agree with us, but we also have to ask for their help.
We live in a very polarized time, and oftentimes when we go out, I'm asked, no, actually, I'm told, no politics tonight, don't talk politics. I think for a lot of us and a lot of people, we don't know how to bring up the difficult conversations. So, what we heard, from Rekindle today was amazing, and how people talk and understand each other. But there's some kind of setting for that when we get started. And I just don't think that people know how to have the difficult conversation. One of the things that Rachel Fish was saying, children, but parents and grandparents seem to be losing that because we're all so afraid to offend someone in these polarized times.
Yeah. Actually, I asked Rachel before she had to leave, sort of what's the takeaway, what's next? And what Michael just said is exactly what she said. She said, what she hears is the needs for how can parents and grandparents educate and express their children and grandchildren for where the world is, how to respond to the world and what to do. So I think that's exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
Doesn't always work, but a curiosity stance, I think, is always my default, because otherwise it's like fight or flight, right? When I'm in those difficult conversations, I get defensive, I get angry, and then I try to take a breath and take a curiosity stance, and just learn more, and sort of check my instinct to argue or bring my facts and say, I want to listen. I'm going to really want to try to understand your perspective, even if I don't agree with it, because that's valuable. And also just the right that everybody has to self-definition, right? This is a Yossi Klein Halevi-ism, that there's the fight for the right for self-determination, but also the fight for the right of self-definition. And I think so often we take over each other's narratives. Right, and we say, well, here's what actually your experience is, and then I'm now using it as a platform with which to further my point, instead of taking a step back and saying, well, you have the right to tell me your experience and your side of the story, your narrative. I have a really dear friend who's Ismaili Muslim, and he was one of the first to call me after October 7th, and even more so than my Jewish friend in the same group. He was the one who said, if I were Israel, I couldn't tolerate this. He was the one, whereas my Jewish friend actually had more trouble with the whole situation. He could more easily say, but he said, but I do have some questions. And he said, I come from, look, full disclosure, like this is my friend speaking, my community of Muslims, I'm getting a lot of that side. I'm not getting a lot of your side. I want to know, even if I affirm, which I do, he said, Israel's right to exist and be a Jewish state. How do you deal with the Palestinian question? What gives you the right to displace is a question I'm asking, right? That was what he asked me. And we can go from there. But the fact that he was willing to affirm my right to self-definition, and then made it easier for me to try to respect his right to self-definition and go from there and take a curiosity stance. I hope that addresses a little bit.
Lance?
So I'm just wondering about how, if anybody is doing this, and if not, how do we do it? There are these opportunities where clergy have interfaith conversations, difficult conversations. We have Rekindle, which is small groups of cohorts. It seems to me that there's a need, like I was looking at GCC recently, and I don't see any of this kind of thing happening in GCC at all. Like here you have all these congregations and nobody's doing any educational conversations. No one's bringing in Kindle to help conduct, or like, I'm thinking of all these ways that if I was, involved in leadership, I would say, okay, you gotta do this. So, but that's what it's on my mind, because that's what seems to be missing for me. Because the average person, it can be very difficult to know where to start, how to begin. You get caught up in fear and you get caught up in awkwardness and so on. I thankfully don't have too much of a problem with that, so I have a big mouth, but I understand how that can be because I used to be that way. So how do we get this beyond just the clergy and the small group here and there? Like I don't understand why GCC hasn't been doing this from the outset. Like you're bringing together people, congregations, it's not just clergy, it's members. Why aren't we having facilitated conversations with some guidelines about how to behave and all of that, and have these conversations and talk about the differences and talk about needs and talk about vulnerabilities and all these things, but we're not doing it. So that's what I'm thinking about. Any comments?
May I? I mean, there are groups that are forming around that, just so you know, like a group of us, who, some of us are involved in GCC and some aren't, formed a group called the Interfaith Group Against Hate. And with the recognition that it's not just us that are experiencing increases in hate, and Olivet and the Chagrin Valley Mosque and Fairmount Presbyterian and St. Dominic's and others are involved. So there are opportunities, I think, happening, and it was specifically trying to address what you're saying, that GCC is one thing, but it wasn't really designed to do that. And I think, we bring people together around community, we have a research team, and we go into action. I mean, the mosque in Solon was just under attack. So I think we can't be all things to all people, and one organization can't, but I think there are things happening in the community like that.
How do we?
Can you get the word out? Because I had no idea that was going on. And I had the same question Lance had. I thought that Adina kind of partially asked it, so I put my hand down. But seriously, we're all here because some of us anyway thought this would be a way of getting into that. And maybe after Shabbat, when we can actually see it in writing, so to speak, or write it down, we could get more information. But I literally had no idea that was going on. And I may not be the most informed person, but I'm also not the least.
Yeah, it's pretty new, but we'll talk to your clergy.
Yeah, also, I will say it was the intention of our chairs in our committee for this to be more than just a conversation for our own B'nai Yeshurun community. I see there's a little spread outside, but our hope is for it to be the larger, both Jewish and general community. I think we're going to learn from it. Also, is not a great weekend. Many constituents are canvassing and doing get out the vote because it's the weekend before the election. And there are other community things happening at the moment. So it is our intention, if we have another weekend like this, to keep working on our resources to expand the conversation. I like Reverend Jessie idea of doing what Tom is doing, right? Of having opportunities to be together in larger settings, which I think the organization that Donna is working with is growing. And GCC, I will say, we're a member of GCC, our congregation is, and that, right, as Donna said, that is not the purpose of GCC, as a very specific purpose, which is raising up our community and seeing what needs to be worked together for community. It's not necessarily understanding each other and learning about each other. And there are very specific things: mental health, criminal justice, education. They're very specific focuses where we gather and work together with our sort of shared communities and shared narratives. So behind the scenes, the leadership is talking about this, but it's a closed behind the scene leadership thing and not open to the larger communities. I want to wrap up with one last question because I know it's getting late. Yes, Sheila.
You mentioned the relationship with the Baptist Church. Could you speak about that a little bit? Like what exactly we're doing, if anything, at this point, and where you see that going?
It's growing. It's growing. I've had a lunch with Pastor Goods, who was here last night. And as I said, Scott Matt is our president, and I went to their anniversary celebration. We are hoping to, I'll use the word rekindle a relationship with that church, because I think it's important for both of us, as well, helping to address an area within Cleveland, a physical area within Cleveland that has a lot of difficulties. And that was an area where our community was based for more than 20 years. And that actually our Chesed committee had adopted a school specifically in that area, central area, because of that feeling of importance of working within that community. And my hope is, I'm not sure everyone knows, but raise your hand if you're going on our civil rights trip in 3 weeks with Rabbi Jacobs. Right? My hope is from the civil rights trip that has over 36 of our own members of our synagogue traveling from Atlanta to Selma to Montgomery to Birmingham, of that there will be a movement, a push within our own congregation to rekindle those relationships that Jews had from the 60s, and that it's not just looking back and celebrating how great it was that Rabbi Heschel marched with Dr. Martin Luther King, right? And that, yay, we were great in civil rights 60 years ago. But what does that mean for us today? And what are those relationships? So we're growing those relationships right now. It's largely just leadership with Shiloh Baptist, but we want it to be really engaged together and breaking bread together, maybe doing some social action, some volunteer projects together, and education.
I'm glad to hear about that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I appreciated the question about Greater Cleveland congregations, because I am new to it and my church is new to it. And the first meeting, my exposure to it was shortly after October 7th. And we can't do everything, but we could do something. And I was upset that day there wasn't a prayer, an acknowledgement, anything. It was so silent. It was deafening. And I was new in that space, and it just really threw me for a loop, shocked me for a while. And I too came to GCC with, well, why aren't they talking about LGBTQ issues? I was upset about that. And we have a large immigration population at Church of the Covenant now from the Congo who worship with us and separately. So I'm also concerned about immigration, and no, GCC doesn't do that either. So it felt like there were a lot of no's. Right. And then I got to understand why. I have to have enough energy to focus on the things locally, and they do a good job of that. And so when this Interfaith Group Against Hate, maybe a month ago, we had our first meeting, it seems like that's the way to do it. And
It's taken us a couple of years, but.
I mean, it was my first meeting. It wasn't, you guys have been on it for a while.
About opening it up
Yeah.
to various groups, and we want to balance and all those things. So we're expanding more now. So we would love to talk more.
Well, this conversation can go on for a very long time. I want to thank Reverend MacMillan for your friendship and partnership with your community. We're grateful that you came here, and hopefully your community can join us too. Thank you everyone for an incredible Shabbat. Rabbi Jacobs and I look forward to debriefing with you and to see this isn't just a weekend, right? This is, we have to have next steps for this. So talking with you about what's next, both for our community, for our synagogue, and, for what we can do. Shabbat Shalom.